think the people that we have studied the Russian Revolution, so there's no need to go into the details of what actually happened. I'll just say, in terms of actually looking at, obviously the book to look at the first instance is that of Trotsky. But the contemporary one is that I think the one by Alexander Verbinovitz, people may have seen. He's recently produced a new edition of it. He originally began working on it in the 60s, and there was an edition in 76. But it appears to me to be the obvious one to be used. It's now produced by Burgh Press, and it's obviously a left-wing account. As far as you can see, there isn't anything really that's been added to it. Alexander Rabinowitz did add something very early on by pointing out there was, in fact, an attempt at a coup, or an attempt to take power rather than a coup, in July, something which was often denied. It was done independent, really, of anyone who opposed it. Anyway, it's described in his book. There's no need to go into it. But if you look at the significance of it, the most important aspect from the point of view of the left, or from the point of view of mankind as perceived by the left, is effectively that it brought to an end the period of class rule. That's to say, it's a period in the history of humanity for the first time introduced a classless rule, truly, to use the word, a truly democratic form for the first time. The time when the working class took power, and the working class, defined as all those who sell their labour power, is the vast majority of mankind anyway, today. The total number of people who are outside that actual position is very small. The number in the peasantry, about 1% who live in the United States. Number, in fact, in the United States of unskilled manual labour is just 5%. The vast majority today are white-collar workers. Anyway, the essential point is that for the first time there was an attempt to take power in the name of the majority of the population, and it succeeded. And so brought to an end a period of permanent class rule. And from then onwards, one could talk of a transition period. Although at the time they expected the Germans, as we all know, to have a revolution, which in fact did not take place. Not that there were no attempts at revolution, but it failed. And it was then that Trotsky actually said in 1919 that the Social Democrats had ensured that there would now be a transition period rather than a period when the working class would be in power. So in that sense, the taking power in 1917 was limited by the subsequent failures. And of course far more limited by the fact that it was set back by 1922 onwards by when Stalin took power. So essentially, for us today, the real issue is at what point the influence of the negation of the Russian Revolution will come to an end. That's the essential issue. Not the Russian Revolution itself, which took place and which we understand as to what it was doing, as I've described. It's not surprising, therefore, that at the present time, when one looks at the discussions of it, the propaganda about it, what appears on the radio, what appears on TV, their description of it is a deliberate obfuscation and very often a travesty of what it actually is. I'm told that in Russia they have a new film of the revolution, which is a deliberate distortion in which instead of Lenin being crucial, he's kind of left out, and Trotsky is shown as the leader who plans the thing from beginning to end. The intent behind the whole film is to make him appear an absolute scumbag, an evil personality, and with that they connect the fact that he was Jewish. So what you've got is a wonderful example of why the revolution should not have taken place, and why what it did was introduce power by the wrong kind of people. That's what they've done in Russia. That's what they're doing in Russia. It's kind of amazing that they could even think of that. But of course the descriptions on the BBC are not like that, but they're also a travesty of what happened. It's common to meet people or to read that various personalities opposed the Russian Revolution on the grounds of mass killing. Now that didn't happen during the revolution itself. That was simply untrue. For some reason I don't understand, there's at least one thesis which is arguing that the Bolsheviks had a certain amount of anti-Semitism. That's not true either. I really don't understand why anybody would argue that. Something like 70,000 Jews were killed, but they were killed by the right, not by the left. The Bolsheviks did their best to oppose it. So there are plenty of examples, therefore, of an attempt to blacken the Russian Revolution as something which was in fact its opposite. In fact, it's very difficult to get across what really happened. The Russian Revolution itself, in more general terms, did a series of things which did change society, though not wholly towards socialism. In the first place, by having an election with, at the time, with the whole population of a certain age taking part, they were breaking with the form of democracy which existed in the West. In the West, you didn't have democracy, full stop. If you look at it in Britain, in 1917, the majority of the population didn't have a vote. There was a property qualification. No women had a vote, and 40% of the men didn't have a vote. To call it a democracy is nonsense. It wasn't. On top of which, you had the House of Lords, which had considerable power, and the king hadn't lost his power either. It wasn't like Germany, that the Kaiser had even more power. But paradoxically, in Germany, there was a more extensive franchise, so that the argument that Britain was fighting for democracy was nonsense, since in Germany, in fact, they had more people able to vote than in Britain. But the Russian Revolution proclaimed the fact that from then onwards, the vote would have to go to everybody. Of course, it didn't happen everywhere, but it did begin to happen thereafter. It became impossible to stop it. So in the first instance, the franchise was then extended first effectively to all men and then to all women. In Britain, this for women was 1928. In the second place, if one looks at it, the Russian Revolution proclaimed the equality of women. Something quite different from what actually existed in Western society, or for the matter in the Third World. And it gave a powerful push towards it, even if it wasn't generally recognized at the time. And that was general throughout the world. Thirdly, by opposing the inequality which existed, they did two things. In other words, standing for equality. Firstly, they opposed the discrimination against people of different constitutions, different colour, etc. And supported in principle and directly at the time the liberation of colonies. It upset the whole colonial administration of the great powers. It directly supported those who wanted to overthrow imperial rule. So it rendered the whole capitalist system simply in imperialist terms unstable. Those three elements have remained down to present day, together with the fourth, which is fairly obvious. If you proclaim equality, you're not only opposing national equality or colour inequality, you're also opposing a class inequality and an inequality of privilege, which at that time, of course, existed very strongly in Britain and other countries, perhaps strongly in Britain than in the United States, let's say, which didn't have a hereditary aristocracy, which did continue to play a role. So it undermined those elements, those four elements I've given, which existed under capitalism, even though capitalism continued and didn't have socialism. That was as were the continuing effect of it, leaving aside the whole question of overthrowing class power for a working class coming to power. The major element of what it did was to open the period, which Trotsky referred to, which I've mentioned. It opened this period when the society could evolve away from capitalism, what Trotsky called the transition period. The view that we live in a transition period, of course, isn't just held by Trotsky, or Trotskyists, but now quite widely held. I see Istvan Mesharis held that viewpoint, for instance, and although he didn't criticize Trotsky, he wasn't a Trotskyist. He was a critical follower of Lukács, as far as I can see. So the point I'm making simply is that it was quite it's quite extensive, the viewpoint that we live in a transition period. Well, it's a much easier viewpoint to hold now the Soviet Union doesn't exist. For people who are on the left, let's say, people who might otherwise be Stalinists and move in this direction, say, we live in a transitional period. So, the next point we want to deal with is why did the revolution take place at the time it did, and what would follow is when would it again take place? The revolution took place in Russia was been described many times, of course. In the first instance, because it was more backward, semi-feudal, dependent on agriculture, and had a very low standard of living. It was described by Trotsky as semi-Asiatic. By that he meant in the mode of production under which it was this partly the Asiatic mode of production, as Marx described it. He wasn't making, of course, a statement about Asia or anything, simply the question of the mode of production. It's quite a complicated discussion as to what exactly existed as a result. But because it was in this mixed position of semi-feudal, semi-Asiatic, it was relatively easier at a point where it was in a transition to capitalism for a revolutionary movement to establish itself. Part of this was the fact that there were no safety valves in that system. There was a strong secret police and arbitrary arrest with capital punishment. All that, although it prevented immediate revolution, of course, antagonized the population. Really had a peculiar position. If you looked at in the 19th century, when the students formed their own attempt at a revolution, that practically all the students were left wing. It wasn't as if a few students wanted to do anything. Practically all the students, there weren't that many in the 19th century anyway, but practically all the students were in fact left wing. One other aspect was absolutely important. Because of the strength of control, it meant the only opposition which could exist was an underground opposition. And it's something, of course, which, once it was founded, meant that it had to have its own rules and its own means of control and its own means of establishing some sort of opposition. There was no other example of it. It had never existed. The foundation, effectively, of what became the Communist Party was founded there. Although there was a Communist Party founded before then in Bulgaria by Burgh. It's true, a few years before him. Nonetheless, the Communist Party, or the Bolshevik Party, which came into existence, was a very different phenomenon to the other parties. It established a form which had never existed in history. And in fact, wasn't repeated in a form that existed under Lenin. It was repeated in a particular form which allowed parties to exist underground. One ought really to discuss the nature of the Communist Party under Lenin. It's clear that Lenin remained in charge from the day he formed the Bolshevik Party, or it was formed, to the day he died. It doesn't sound like a very democratic form. But clearly he ruled from one end to another. But on the other hand, when one looks at the revolution itself, it wasn't always in direct control, and it did look as if there was a spontaneous movement. Alexander Rabinovich actually brings this out when he's discussing the revolution on the day itself, let's say on the 25th of November, or 25th of October, or the 7th of November. He pointed out how spontaneous, in fact, the ordinary people were, or ordinary soldiers were, in deliberately standing for taking power and against the generals. There's a number of examples of how these soldiers deliberately refused orders on a spontaneous basis. So obviously, the Bolshevik Party, as it was, in spite of the fact that it had to exist underground with a form of discipline and a form of interaction which was much more highly developed by the underground under the Nazis, nonetheless appear to have a level of interaction, if you put it like that, or a level of democracy which allowed a great deal of support for the leadership, which one might not have expected. But that hasn't been duplicated in the same way in most of the successor communist parties. The next aspect of the society which made it prone to a revolution was that it had both an aristocracy and national oppression, which meant that the layers of society which might otherwise have aspired to ascend in the hierarchy weren't able to do so. So that it was highly immobile from that point of view. The aristocracy remained in control, the Tsar remained the supreme leader, and the middle class therefore found itself contained insofar as it was actually developing. The intellectuals, or a substantial number of intellectuals, would tend towards the left, which is what happened. As quoted before, in fact, the Narodniki were largely students and they were practically all left-wing. So what you had was a very substantial section of the intellectuals who'd gone left, who were left-wing. And you had a revolutionary literature, which really made the society highly unstable. And all that was happening was that at some point you knew it would break out. The peculiarity, of course, was that when it did, in 1917, it basically broke out because of the war, which had actually ruined much of the society. Millions were killed because people had reached the end of their tether, effectively. But the war itself was going on, and that itself, bourgeois literature does not explain. The war was taking place as an automatic result of what amounted to the decline of capitalism and a situation where capital itself had reached a crisis. It reached a crisis in Britain in 1870, the long depression from 1870 to 1890, which was dealt with effectively through imperialism. The war was part of that process. Britain had in the 1880s decided to have a fleet which was twice as big as any other fleet. The financing for this was of course enormous. War from that point of view was a means of control which allowed capitalism to go further. But at a certain point, of course, it would be bound to break down. They had no way of ending the war. The rational thing for the capitalist class to have done would have been to have ended the war before then. But they couldn't do that. And at first, of course, the war served the purpose. It did stabilize the society. It stabilized it in economic terms, it stabilized it in social terms. By 1917, the country, which was, from this point of view, from a social point of view, which was weakest, broke. That appears to me to be the essential basis of it. That's to say, capitalism was itself in crisis. Capitalism found a way out through the World War. It's not that they consciously did it, but that is the way it went. The use of wars and armaments as a means of dealing with the surplus is of course well known. They can't do it today, because it's impossible to have a war without destroying the world. So it's not likely to happen. Again, which of course makes the crisis more long-term. However, the essential point is that the revolution took place as a necessary result at a certain point within the capitalist system. It took place in Russia, as Lenin said, because it was the weakest link. Well, as we know, the revolution, in a sense, was defeated by 1922, 1923, when Stalin took power. There's no other way of putting it. Why did Stalin take power? One could ask the question of whether the nature of the party was such that he could take power. Or one could also point to the fact that the Civil War wasn't really just a civil war. You had 14 countries invading. 7 million people were killed. The society was turned upside down. It would have been extremely difficult to get to a point where the standard of living was at a sufficient level where people had a reasonable amount to eat at a time. So it was inevitable that there would be some kind of change. The question was, what would happen from there? One can argue on this question. Deutsche argued that Trotsky should have taken power in 1924. I think, looking back from today, we can say that would have been better. It would have been better simply because you wouldn't have had the Stalinist reaction. And the idea of Stalinist reaction would have been automatic if Trotsky had been there. I don't think it's true. Trotsky himself just said he didn't take power because if he took power, he would have become like Stalin. I don't think that's true. However, it's a fair argument. Anyway, what, as we know, happened was something which was so colossal and so awful that I don't think anybody could have dreamed of it. It was certainly worse than anything else in history. It was worse than the numbers who were killed by Julius Caesar, or Genghis Khan, or Timur, both in numbers and in the torture which was actually involved. Well, one can't say that the West ordered it, it clearly didn't, but it was a result of their deliberate attempt to stop it. So turning the society upside down and turning it into a chaotic form in which a layer of the population attempted to maintain control, and which took on I'm going to say, a very peculiar and singular form in the end, with one man, Stalin, really being in power. Apart from the people I've mentioned, like Genghis Khan, it's very seldom that you've had a single person who wielded such enormous power, such that no one could do anything against him, unless they did in 1953, when he apparently died. So the problem for us is that to this day, most people associate the revolution with Stalinism. The torture which happened under Stalin probably has no comparison, because the Stalinist secret police had access to torture instruments which earlier periods couldn't have had. We know that in Britain in the 15th, 16th century, 17th century, they used torture. But this went far beyond it. So the reputation of the Russian Revolution is easy to besmirch and to try and put the two together, which is what the ruling class has done. And really, it's unfortunate that the task of socialists, as it were, ever since, has been to try and explain that this was not what happened in the early years, and this was never intended and never would have happened except as a counter-revolution. it's clear that the ruling classes continued to maintain the position that the revolution was anti-democratic and anti-human, in fact. And their picture of it is so awful that no human being would actually want it. It was at all reasonable. And it is that picture which has kept us away from socialism for 100 years. That's what it boils down to. The revolution was successful in its initial phases, but once Stalinism took over, it was turned into its opposite, to such a degree that it has been impossible to have a revolution since, or a move towards socialism. Socialism, of course, does not actually need a revolution, as it were, immediately, and nor does it, in one sense, need a violent revolution, because socialism isn't dependent on a revolution. The society itself is changing towards this greater and greater socialization. That's the way it's going anyway. Only problem is, if you just leave it the way it's going, it'll take a few hundred years. So the task remains. The problem remains for us. How to get across that there really is an alternative, that the alternative was proclaimed at that time, that has been besmirched ever since. And socialism remains the goal of mankind. Thank you.
All the other questions or contributions then? Just on the last point made, Hillel, that the idea that socialism seems to be saying inevitable. There is a dynamic towards it that will, if given sufficient time, result in a socialist society. I mean, there's a few things I would cast doubt on that. One, the danger of, the ecological problems that we see, the deterioration that's obviously happening in that regard. Second, you're ruling out war altogether, are very unlikely, but it seems to me, that with the proliferation of nuclear weapons, the danger of that does increase, and at the point that you might get extreme irrationality from a capitalist class who does launch a war in a situation that would result in planetary destruction. You can't rule that out. And the third aspect of the idea that there's an inevitable dynamic towards socialism is it could result in quite a conservative posture, because you could, with that view that it's inevitable, say, well, look, if the working class moves too quickly and too soon, it will just go through the same process as we've seen in the Russian Revolution. You will have a situation where the response of the ruling class internationally will be fierce. It will result in a poverty and destruction for the people that took the advanced step towards revolution, and it will result in a big defeat for the working class. Far better to just hold on to your forces, to try and see things develop towards socialism, develop the democratic forms as best as you can, but be very conservative in that you don't rush into something, any vanguard actions that don't have an absolute guarantee of success, because obviously the working class paid a terrible price for failures, and the Russian working class must be one of the big examples of it, where they went out to fight for that, and they've suffered 100 years or whatever of tragedy, and now the forces of socialism in Russia and Eastern Europe are, it would seem, minuscule in terms of the conscious forces. So that's a point I would make.
I would say, in terms of what you've just said, I think it's slightly better than that, because from my point of view, certainly looking at the moment, one thing that really strikes me is how open it is at the moment. There are very few forces now that actually have means of control. And actually, if you look at numbers of whichever country, there's actually very little in terms of political obstacles in the way of the working class actually organising itself and put forward demands which in many cases are highly popular. I mean, if you look at them in this country, for instance, I mean, the advent of Corbyn, through basically a screw-up in the Labour Party, the fact that social democracy, it's essentially, in a completely decayed state, and that you've had this big upsurge of people, looking for some kind of political alternative, and the fact that, in fact, things like the basic instruments of capitalist rule are not very popular. I mean, basically, you can reasonably attack things, whole areas, in terms of the methodology of the state, the banks, the whole lot. All these things are up in question, and what being politically active at the moment, the problem you've got is the degree of consciousness among the activists and the active layer of the working class, as opposed to there is some mechanism of control, because the mechanism of control at the moment are very, very frayed, and I think that's the case in large parts of the world. I mean, you see it even in the US, where the ruling class has resorted to an idiot, and the use of permanent war, as a means of an attempt to control the rest of the world, which has essentially destroyed the basis of human society across chunks of the Middle East. It's crazy. It really is mad and bizarre what's happening now. So I mean, in those terms, I think it's okay. It's festering and the rest of it, but in terms of the possibilities, we're all there.
Yes, I agree with both of you. I wasn't arguing that there is no possibility of socialism tomorrow. What I was pointing out is that the movement to socialism is inbuilt in the nature of the relationship between humanity and the means of production over time. But at a certain point, the only way it can actually work successfully and well is in a socialized form. That doesn't mean to say that you automatically get there. At a certain point, if it simply goes on, it will be so decayed that it might happen more easily. It doesn't mean to say there won't be a revolution to get there. That was all I was saying. But what I'm saying in terms of the present, on the one hand, we have propaganda, which is dominant, in fact. It may not be dominant in some small groups or whatever, but over society generally, throughout the world, this viewpoint that the revolution in some sense failed and therefore cannot be repeated is dominant. What I was saying was that one doesn't have to argue it simply in terms of a revolution. We have to argue that they are wrong, but it's more than that. The society itself is changing towards socialism anyway. The forces are moving there. So in other words, it's relatively easy, or easier as time goes on, to see that. We can see it today immediately. People aren't describing it, but we ought to describe it in those terms. That the market is more limited, like today, or to give the obvious examples. Education and medicine have to be done by society as a whole. It just doesn't work when it's private, etc., etc. And on top of that, the people actually working in these two sectors can't simply be made to work through competition and more money. They have to want to do it, to study it, etc. Now all that goes beyond the market. That's obvious. Everybody knows it, except they don't think of it in those terms. And we have to be able to simply show people that is generally true. But the point I was just making is that as our society develops, as capitalism develops, it's in decline. These forms are showing themselves. They have to go beyond that. The forms of competition effectively are more and more in trouble. That's again fairly obvious, even if some Marxists seem to think that monopoly doesn't exist, or is no important. But obviously the monopoly form is not the same as the original capitalist form as described by Marx. Lenin's description of capitalism at the time as a capitalism in decline, and one of its major forms of its decline is that it's now got monopolistic competition in it, which is perfectly true. Now these are the changes which are happening in our society and are going further. So that one can imagine that if the capitalist society still exists in 100 years' time, it'll be different from today, moving in this direction. But nonetheless, the majority of the population remain exploited and are not in control. That's true. And I wasn't arguing that the left shouldn't try and argue for the working class to take power as soon as possible. Of course it must. And if it doesn't do that, it's perfectly possible that there'll be a whole series of actions which will make things worse for everybody. That's perfectly true. It probably will happen. We could well have small wars or bigger wars where millions get killed, yes. That's perfectly true. And therefore, it's the duty of the left to strive to take power as soon as possible. Of course, and it's possible that it will. And I hope it's probable, in fact, that will be the case. All I'm pointing out is that this process of socialization goes on, so that in a sense, it is inevitable that socialism will come about, unless there's total destruction. It's inevitable to take place. But if we wait until that time, civilization may have gone through so many awful episodes that it's clear that we shouldn't wait to that time. Okay?
I can think, I mean, I do most of what I'm saying, but I think it can be encapsulated in the sense that the process of production are vastly outgrown the social relations of production. That's the fundamental contradiction we're now in. If you look at the process of production, they're huge. You know, use of computing, the use of robots, it's now an everyday thing, you know. What happens to the people then? What happens to the social relations when this vast increase in the process of production are already there? Well, again, you know, people will act in a mass sense. Just, they don't act in a mass social sense. Look at Catalonia, look at Scotland, look at Iran, look at, you know, wherever, you know. People are looking for forms of change. It's just the forms of change they're looking for. Tend to look back to the past. Or we need smaller nation states rather than a large economic unity, etc. You know, all this is really, it's, you know, it's inevitable. It's going to come to an end at some point. And what's really ultimately going to be posed as a socialist transformation. Because objectively the conditions are they're not just somewhat rotten now, they're actually tweeted, you know, and it's crying out for it.
Well, I'm quite fascinated by the whole evolutionary thing, so I don't really have any big points to make, but I will say from like in the productive forces that we're seeing, we are seeing a lot of socialisation that maybe isn't necessarily obvious from outside the geek circles that I move in. So computers, as you mentioned, are quite huge. We've got a movement called free and open source. So basically you do your work and you distribute it to everybody. All the plans that you make, you distribute to everybody. And this, you know, it drives your phone, it drives Facebook, it drives all the forms of communication that we have. So these forces that you're talking about, productive forces, they really are becoming more social for every single second that passes because everybody's collaborating. So I do see hope, and I don't know whether my question to you would be just like as a materialist kind of thing. Things happen from this whole chain of whatever things evolve to a point where they evolve And for me, I've got in my head that events, shall we say, I know they're not, but happen when they can happen. So like you're talking about, how do we beat our heads off the wall? Do we try to make a difference? Like Marx wrote this 150 years ago, but we didn't have instant socialism. So are we just in a point of time where we're aware that this stuff is inevitable and we can point to things that says it's happening, but we just have to hang on and find out when it does happen? Or like you said, do we go, will it all end up in a nice mushroom cloud sometime? I mean, we can have both these discussions, but I just wonder how you feel about, as a materialist, what kind of actual impact can the thoughts that we're having here actually have on shaping that, or bring it closer maybe?
I think consciousness is changing, and I think it is becoming more social. I mean, although the ideology that you've got is much more a dog eat dog and people sleeping rough, real barbarism actually, in that respect. Instead of the Glasgow as a joke now, it's barbaric. I have to castrate every day, and it's sickening. Look at it. There's no reason why people should be sleeping rough in the state, And as these things start, as that contradiction starts to unfold even more, it's going to become clearer to people that we have to organise together, And the question is, what forms it take? Again, it's not going to take a bourgeois form. I think that's played out. There's no chance of it happening in a bourgeois form anyway, given that the level of productive forces and decay and decline in the bourgeoisie. It can't happen in a bourgeois form. It can only happen in a socialist form. I actually think we should be, I mean, it might seem quite black at the moment, but I think things could turn relatively quickly. And I think really the left should be organised on the basis that that's going to be the case. Unfortunately, it isn't.
Yeah, just for my own benefit, Professor, if you could elaborate maybe on the forces, both the internal and external forces that contributed towards Stalinism. Was it inevitable in a sense, or were there actions that could have been done to prevent it? Isolation of Russia at the time, was it to do with the level of productive forces hadn't matured sufficiently to enable a revolution to be sustained for any length of time? What were the factors that you feel could avoid that scenario in future revolutions of a degeneration of the revolution?
Well, it's unlikely that it repeats itself in that way, because it was so extreme. The first most important aspect of it was a society which was already backward. Over 80% of the population were peasants, and they only just maintained their standard of living, such as it was. When you read the history, you can read the periods in which the peasants would basically go to sleep for the winter. So the first aspect of it was simply that it could not by itself have begun to develop the means of production. It wasn't the position of Germany where the means of production were already developed and could develop further. They had the beginnings of industrialization, but it was limited. The fact that there was that industrialization meant that there was a working class, but it was small. And the revolution took place largely through the working class taking power. In fact, when they took power in Petrograd, it was peaceful. Working class took over. That was the beginning and end of it. So the first aspect of it was simply the backwardness of Russia. The second was the Civil War, which, as I said, almost certainly would not either have taken place or wouldn't have lasted as long if it had not been for the great powers invading it. 14 countries did invade, it wouldn't have lasted that long. As it was, obviously parts of the country were destroyed. The standard of living dropped, quite apart from the 7 million who died. So it was extremely difficult to exist under those circumstances. And it wasn't possible to use socialist incentives. And many of the cadre of the Bolshevik Party had died. So effectively there was a coup d'etat by the elements around Stalin. And he used the secret police to maintain himself in power, effectively. You could ask why the secret police accepted it, because it wasn't quite so simple that they all supported Stalin. They didn't. There were members of the secret police who clearly were opposed to Stalin. However, the usual argument is that in those circumstances, part of the Communist Party was corrupted. In that they were living in a much better position than the vast majority of the population. It wasn't the whole Communist Party, part of it was. And secondly, that the topmost layer, let's say Stalin and those immediately around him, ended up in a position of direct power and related to the bureaucratic apparatus which had remained from Tsarist times. It wasn't that the bureaucrats themselves were somehow worse. The point is that they weren't socialist. Consequently, Stalin tried to rule through using straightforward coercive measures, or through conceding to the right one way or another. That didn't work. The problem, in other words, was that even though Stalin had seized power, I don't remember what he did, was to exile Trotsky, and then he began to jail members of the Communist Party. And once he was in power, it became more and more difficult, because of course the old Bolsheviks basically opposed him. So effectively he had the real Communist Party, the original Communist Party, standing opposed to him, but elements which had gone over to him, like Molotov and so on, went with him. They were subordinate members. I think it was Lenin who said of Molotov that he has an iron backside. That was the new bit. Zadnica in Russian. So that was the kind of caliber which he had with him. Obviously, Trotsky and the left did not, and others didn't foresee what was to come. They couldn't have seen it. It's hard to believe that they wouldn't have tried to do something otherwise. Once Stalin had made his moves, it was very difficult to undo it. His first step in doing that was to concede to the peasantry, so to get the peasantry on his side. And in doing that, he outflanked Trotsky, who argued for industrialization. Yet, on the hand, Stalin got the support of the peasantry, who simply wanted to get a bigger return for what they were producing. That didn't work, so he lost the peasantry. He then turned on the peasantry. After that, he didn't have any support at all. He was really standing in mid-air, and he progressively used the secret police. There's never been in history a secret police so powerful. And when you're talking of the numbers who died, the official line that still comes from Russia is 3 million died in purges. In 1934, they held 70th Party Congress. The different accounts of this. When I was in Moscow, they told me, the students from I knew, told me that there were different versions. And one version actually said that Stalin was deposed. However it was clear that the Congress wanted to replace him. So he got rid of Kirov, who was the immediate proposer. And from then onwards, since he was now suspended above the Communist Party, he maintained power by direct rule. He had no support whatsoever, except outside of the secret police. He completely devastated the army, just cut down the top of the army. So he had the total force in society, and he had this peculiarity, which is in a society in the 20th century, where one man ruled. He really did rule. With the secret police, but he ruled. And the numbers who died, I think one figure is something like 12 million died in the purges. That's apart from the peasants who died from lack of food. For the numbers who died for one reason, one economic reason or another, who had died in the Civil War or wars. Effectively, it became impossible to oppose Stalin. And in fact, it was impossible to oppose the regime even after the death of Stalin. What came into being was a degree of control which has never existed in human society, which if there were three people, you could be certain that one person could report you to the secret police. There was no way that there could be a genuine opposition which would last more than a few minutes. The depths to which they would go, I think, was well illustrated by the example given of what happened to an economist, who, as it happened, was a Menshevik in 1930. Rubin was a Menshevik economist. He was a Marxist of a kind, who produced a series of books, who was jailed by the Stalinist regime in 1930. And the secret police put a man in his cell whom they told Rubin they would kill unless he gave them the information they required. Well, obviously, he didn't give the information, so they killed the man. For anybody to be put in that position is fantastic, but that gives you the nature of the regime. The Stalin regime had nothing to do with socialism. It was obviously one of the worst regimes which has ever existed, or possibly the worst regime which has ever existed in human history. There's no way an individual could do anything within that society, however much you may oppose it.
Were there fundamental limitations in terms of the revolution at the start, and in terms of what you mentioned before about the lack of numbers of the proletariat hadn't sufficiently developed? It was mainly peasantry, and the fact that the productive forces hadn't matured, unlike other. Were those limitations always going to be a barrier to the full development of what happened?
That's a good point. Yes, that was there. Lenin didn't, Trotsky or the left in Russia didn't think they could build socialism in one country, quite apart from the development of the country. But nobody thought they could build socialism in Russia. They did their best to try to get to Germany. That's why in 1920, when the Red Army had won and had defeated the invading Polish army, That's why Lenin got the army to march into Poland, and his aim wasn't to conquer Poland, but to get to Germany. Because he, and they in general, didn't believe socialism country was possible, and certainly not in Russia by itself. That's quite true. There's no way they can build it by itself. But they didn't take power in order to take power in Russia alone. When they proclaimed taking of power, they proclaimed it as part of the socialist revolution in the world, not just in Russia. That's true. On the other hand, by implication, what you're asking is, what would have happened if the force of Russia was somewhat better developed? What would have happened if they hadn't been invaded and so on? Well, clearly they would have lasted longer, and the possibilities would have been different.
Can I kind of ask you your thoughts, a kind of related series of questions round about Leninism and what that actually represented? Now, we can easily, I think, dismiss the kind of right-wing stuff, you know, from Leonard Shapiro right through to Jan Applebaum. They seem determined to kind of, you know, crowbar in Lenin to Stalin. It's bizarre, really. It doesn't really fit. Jan Applebaum's latest book about the famine in Ukraine, it's strange. They keep trying to wedge in Lenin as being a kind of inevitable precursor to Stalin. So I think the right-wing argument doesn't stand very well the test of time. It's still dominant, but it becomes more shaky the longer time goes on and research fills out the actual detail of what happened, and the Stalinist myth starts to fade, which is good. But what I like your thoughts about Hillel is the whole Lenin question. Some of your thoughts about what Lars Lee has said about Leninism, how it related to mainstream German social democracy. You mentioned the kind of illegality, the nature of the enforced illegality in Russia. And it seems to be that Lee's arguing that Leninism really wasn't very much, Bolshevism wasn't very much, other than German social democracy in illegal conditions. And I'd like your thoughts about that. Would you agree with that? Or do you think there's something different about Bolshevism? You know, whether it's like Marcel Liebman, or Victor Serge, or even Simon Paradi, for example. What was it that was specific about Bolshevism? Could another type of party other than a Bolshevik type party have led the working class to power in October? Or was it a kind of necessary precondition? Was there something special about Leninism that was quite different from European social democracy? Was it unique? Was it a kind of hybrid? And what are the lessons of that today for the party form? Is that gone? Because, you know, we Trotsky from the 20s and 30s, Trotsky still clearly regards the party in those kind of ideological battles for clarity of the party to be central. Is that now gone? Does that remain a kind of central kind of issue for Marxists?
It's a good point, which ought to be argued out in some detail across a number of questions. First, I don't agree with Lars Lee at all. I think he's talking nonsense. Or, alternatively, he's trying to rehabilitate Stalinism. In his last writing, he says he found a document from 1934. Well, maybe the document is accurate, but 1934 is a terrible date. Stalin began to forge documents very early on. And I was told this is interesting, that I met with Serbrakov's daughter. There were three general secretaries in 1920, Preobrazhensky, Kristinsky, and Serbrakov. Serbrakov's daughter I met by coincidence. And she was an historian, and she told me the story, which is of course obviously written, how Stalin invented a date, October 14th, when there was a meeting of the Politburo, when he was president and Trotsky was not present. They decided to have a revolution. There was no such document and there was no such meeting. He'd simply forged the document. But he had done that early on. And Lenin's secretary apparently exposed it in 25. One way or another. She told me the story. I didn't know the particular instance. I haven't checked it elsewhere, but I'm sure it's true. He forged many documents. So if he could do that, what happened in 1934, etc., one has to be very careful about it. It may be impossible to prove it one way or another. So I would be very dubious about it. Secondly, the overall argument in terms of the April thesis that somehow Stalin and Molotov or whoever had been in Petrograd in February, March, were in favor of taking power then, and therefore urged Lenin to do it, as opposed to Lenin opposing them. Why now? Why all of a sudden Lars Lee, who isn't exactly, who is certainly not, as it were, is certainly not Trotskyist, he's anti-Trotsky. Why? It doesn't make sense to me. Then if you actually look at Lenin, the thing about Lenin was he was quite capable of changing his mind. He didn't go around saying, I said this, and therefore I will say this for the rest of my life. So he wouldn't have been ashamed to do that. And one can't assume that he didn't change his mind. Any good thinker would. Anybody who sticks to one statement for the rest of his life, because he made that statement, is a complete idiot. And that wasn't Lenin. So I don't know why they're making such a big fuss of it. Secondly, to argue that the working class peasantry, or the section of the peasantry who didn't have any land, who worked for others, were part of the proletariat is obviously true. But to argue that the whole peasantry supported the Bolsheviks is nonsense. And somehow think that Lenin was then arguing in favor of the democratic taking of power of the proletariat and peasantry, the democratic dictatorship of proletariat and peasantry in 1917, well, you'd have to be an idiot to be doing that. He would obviously know that the peasantry, which did in the end support the Bolsheviks when they took power, because the other side didn't support them. But he would know that the peasantry which owned the land and kept the land wasn't really on their side. They may go with them, but the idea that there is a dictatorship of proletariat and peasantry, in my view, was always wrong. How can one argue in terms of dictatorship of proletariat and peasantry? What does that mean? If you read what Lenin actually said, to me it didn't make any sense when he actually said it. I'm not clear why he did, but he certainly did. And how you get put together the dictatorship of the peasantry, the guys who own the land together with the guys who work for them. I don't know. I think there clearly is a difference between Lenin talking about the democratic dictatorship of proletariat and peasantry, where he did perceive a non-socialist revolution, in which the proletariat were ruling together with peasantry, for a time where ultimately the proletariat would throw out the peasantry. That's what it boiled down to. is simply a conception which he dreamed up as a means of getting a degree of support, I presume, at the time. Or he believed that there had to be a two-stage revolution of that time. And basically changed his mind in April 1917. I think that's effectively what happened. Why one should argue anything else, I don't know, unless what you want to do is to establish a new orthodoxy against Trotskyism or something. That's all I can think of. I think he's simply wrong in that respect. And why one has to say that Lenin was always right, I don't know. Or Trotsky was all right, if anybody was always right. To me, they weren't. Sometimes they were wrong. So, I don't think very much of it at all. I'm talking of Leninism. Lenin clearly ruled the party from day one until he became ill. Yeah, he clearly was run by that. On the other hand, I don't know how he did it, but when you read the description of the Russian Revolution itself, as written, say, by Alexander Rabinovich, Trotsky is somebody else, you might say, then he brings out how spontaneous the thing was. So somehow Lenin, although he remained on top, did succeed in a degree of democracy within the party. I'm not clear exactly how he did it, but he apparently did it in that way. There was a degree of discussion and so forth. Well, we know that there were regular congresses each year, 1918, 1920, and so forth, and debates where basically they were always won by Lenin. Which you could argue that Lenin should have had the sense to be in a minority more often, or should have been tried to get a democratic system working, which clearly didn't happen. What really happened was that when he took the decision, it was passed. So it's true, there was in that respect, the Bolshevik Party would not be something which ought to be copied. But of course, in a certain sense, it was copied, and that in the period after the 1920s, when the communist parties came into existence in fullest form, they came in the form of Stalinist parties, in which the Central Committee and the General Secretary ruled. I think that's true. There's a certain continuity in there. I'm not certain that you could say the same about the formation of communist parties with the Comintern coming into being in 1919, 1920, 1921. They tended to be more democratic, but that was broken when they were Stalinized. Certainly, the obvious thing that you can say is that the Leninist party did not have rules which ensured a degree of discussion within the party. I think that's true. On the other hand, you have to ask the question, if you're underground, can you actually have it? Almost certainly can't.
Well, but the question of Soviets, I mean, when it was very slowly picking up Soviets, Trotsky was far better than even 1905. Trotsky's writing Soviet powers way forward. When it doesn't come to that position until
That's true.
1917. And even then, because the Bolsheviks didn't have a majority within the Soviets, he wanted to take power through tribunals in June, July.
Yeah, that's quite true.
So,
It's quite
it was flexible, yes, but, it was theoretical when it came to the actual organs of one-class power.
Well, it's absolutely true. Lenin wanted to take power on October the 1st, and it was Trotsky persuaded him to make it October 25th when the Soviet met. That's quite true. Although you could then say, well, the fact is they took power first and then the Soviet met. When the Soviet actually met on October 25th, they had already taken power.
They need an organ to do the actual.
Well, they didn't have a majority in the Soviet when they took over on October 25th, but they had sufficient because you had the left SRs. Yes. Yeah, that's true. I mean, there's no question in terms of the history. We don't actually a solution as to how one has a democratic party with full discussion from one end to another under conditions where it's very difficult to have such a thing. In other words, where if one imagines a political party today forming itself, becoming sufficiently important, one would have to assume that it would then be penetrated by the secret police and there'd be all sorts of problems involved. The question then is, could it be democratic under those conditions?
I think in those terms, in my experience of being in any kind of democratic organisation, of course, is what you have is a series of factions, declared or undeclared, and people, there's then a series of debates on the particular issues, which in many cases carry on for years, and people have, developed their own political ideas and traditions and so on.
In many cases, in all cases.
Well, not necessarily. Usually, in Britain, it's usually wound up in a split. Unfortunately, you can normally say the health of an organisation and how many different strands of argument can it actually contain within itself. Normally in Britain, not for very long. But the thing, what Angus was talking about is also to look at. You talk about the desperation of the Bolsheviks to link up with Germany. There's also the mess that happened within Germany, and the fact that in Germany they did actually have about a whole series of different opportunities to take power and mess them all up. And certainly to you can go through them, and the fact that they, in virtually all cases they made the wrong tactical and strategic decisions and resulted in their own leaders being killed, etc., etc. And that really sort of, then it creates this issue in terms of the destiny of the revolution across the world. And what I think it's then, the question it does raise is, okay, well, how is it that the movements of the working class and the left can produce something of sufficient political force and ability to actually take on the necessary questions? And the problem is, of course, since essentially the dissolution of that generation, that we haven't had such. We really haven't had such. And okay, we can say, well, okay, there's an issue of all these critical people being liquidated and so on by the Stalinists. But since the fall of Stalinism in the early 90s, the standards of the left has been, to say at least, fairly pathetic in terms of its either its political understanding, its political development, or its effort, in fact, to organise the working class. And this really is the big gap we see now.
Yes, it's very difficult to have a party which, on the one hand, needs to have a clear line, on the other hand, needs a democratic form, which is what you illustrated. And it's perfectly true. You take the example of the IMG, which had 6 factions and split 6 ways. Clearly one needs a different form, which doesn't take the other extreme of the SWP, where you have a permanent leadership, limited discussion. Yes. Very obviously, what keeps a leadership together is a party which has sufficient members that people don't want to leave it just like that, or form factions which will actually break away. The problem is to see how one can get to that point.
talked earlier about society becoming more socialised and going down the road of possibly the inevitability of socialism at some future date. In terms of the possibilities of that, and comparing it to the Russian Revolution, the states now, imperial states now, are becoming more powerful and organised and more centrally based with strong military. In a sense, could it not become in future more difficult for revolutions to take place given that context and not easier?
So you're saying if states become more militarised?
No, as states are becoming more powerful and more militarised and more centrally focused, would it not be the case that revolutions would become more difficult in future as opposed to easier?
No, on the contrary. You could say that states were becoming more militarised at the end of the 19th century or something. At the present time, the EU is not an accident. And Trotsky talked of the United States of Europe not because he simply had an abstract slogan, but because it's necessary for the different countries to come together for political economic reasons. You see, the EU exists today because their economies interact and it's most efficient if they are together. Britain breaking away from the point of view of the capitalist class is a disaster. Leave aside what we think about it. From the point of view of capital, from the point of view of big business, from the point of view of the immediate economy within capitalism, it is stupid. It's utterly stupid for Britain to leave the EU. It's unbelievable. Half their trade is with the even higher percentage of the services are with EU, so they break away. Well, they're completely nuts. So the integration today of the world economy is greater than it has ever been, and is increasingly integrated. But that's what you expect, because you don't expect every part of the universe to invent everything and to have no specialization. Whatever the reason for the different specializations, they tend to occur in various countries, and then they interact. That is the necessary way in which the force of production actually develop. So the integration of Europe, after all, was foreseen even by General de Gaulle, who talked of the unity of the regions, not even of the country, of the regions from the Atlantic to the Urals, which is the kind of picture which the capitalist class would have ideally of the world. But if you're thinking of it in socialism, of course, it would allow these forces to continue and develop, so that what one would be getting would be a very high level of integration, which is partly an aspect of socialization itself.
Well, it's also more democratic. There's nothing particularly democratic with the EU institutions.
That's true.
You know, the Parliament really is a joke, you know.
Yeah.
It's effectively managed bureaucratically.
There's another aspect of this. I've just talked about the EU, but the fact is the world is integrated into an American empire. The United States is crucial to the world economy, and in fact, it has its ships, its military all throughout the world. This we all know, of course. And we live in an American empire. It just happens that they now have an idiot who is busy breaking it up, but he can't really break it up. But he's got a doctrine which is crazy. But
It's in decline.
It's in decline. It's in decline. It's quite true. It's in decline, and he reflects that decline.
To the nth degree.
What?
To the nth degree. Decline of everything.
And just on with at one point, I mean, the lesson seems to be of the Russian Revolution is in one sense that it was a gamble, and it was a gamble on the international wave, the revolutionary wave that was taking place at that point throughout Europe. Could succeed in the working class taking power in Germany and France and spreading to Europe, and therefore having the basis for building a socialist society.
I don't think it was really a gamble.
Well,
maybe I thought it was inevitable. Russia's going to go That's just going to spread to Germany.
Well, in fact, when I say it's a gamble, it never worked. It was a gamble where the working class lost and has suffered tremendously. Okay, there's been some positive side effects that we still have, the ones you mentioned about, you know, them granting concessions to the working class because the ruling class feared the working class taking power, so they gave concessions regarding the right to vote, concessions later on with the welfare state that they gave because of the fear of the working class. But because the working class took power and provoked a counter-revolution, it suffered, you know, massive historical defeat that we've had for 70 or 80 years of work. So, in one of the lessons that I put forward is that when the working class moves to take power, it has to be sure that it's got sufficient strength, socialist consciousness, to be able to do it internationally. The idea of trying to take power even in one country now would be a big mistake. The idea of the working class in Greece taking power, if it wouldn't immediately spread, if it would be an adventure, would be, you know, and we look at what's happened in Catalan, you could have discussions, but it has to be an international movement, and it has to have prospects of internationally succeeding. And we're obviously quite a way away from that at the moment in terms of consciousness and organisation. Obviously I agree about the forces of production growing and the potential for socialism quite quickly once the working class realises it can take power being introduced is definitely there. But there is the danger that the working class will take power in certain areas, or sections of the left will be adventurous and take power in certain areas and provoke a tremendous defeat and a tremendous negative lesson, because in some respects the Russian Revolution is a negative lesson for the working class, unfortunately. It's if you're not well organised to take power internationally, you are going to suffer terrible tribulations, and that's what the Russian working class has done. So, you know, it's conservative. That's the point I'm putting forward.
You're assuming, Sandy, that some current on a natural basis is going to have a mass support and it's going to move towards an adventure. I don't see that being possible. Look at the left, say the left, the revolution left. It's a joke. You know, there's nobody capable of doing that. I mean, it's just, it'll never gain that type of mass support.
I think that is true, and it's partly true because the working class sees the price that it will pay for that, right?
I think it's also true because it's got to be international.
It has to be an international movement.
I knew it was going to be.
But we have seen repeated attempts by the left, or sections of the left, saying Cuba takes power, right? Isolated, and you have a form of a police state.
It wasn't left wing.
No, it wasn't left wing.
It was stuff from left wing of
Guevara, etc. I think it would generally be regarded as left wing, right? And it still would identify, obviously, strong Stalinist influence, but they did take power and overthrow a very brutal ruling class.
American foreign policy is just idiotic as regards Cuba. Easily have handled Cuba.
My last point in that is simply that the working class has to organise internationally, and we have to build up mass socialist consciousness before the working class will be willing to take power, before it will be willing to take the risk of taking power, because to take power prematurely in an isolated situation in any particular part really threatens obliteration for working class people and their living standards. And you know, it's a point you could develop, but that's the point I was wanting to make. That's one of the lessons I've drawn. Have we any other questions, and then maybe ask Hillel to sum up? Anything else? Any closing remarks? Before we go to the pub.
Well, I think it was a very good discussion. The last point Sandy made is very important. And perhaps we should have a deeper discussion about it. Lenin does actually say, and it was printed in the Weekly Worker as well, I don't know if they intended it, but because the line of the Weekly Worker is different. And they say you have to have two countries.
That's more than one, isn't it? Socialism in two countries.
Yes, it's more than one. Lenin's line was that you just have to take power where you can. If you see it as a chaotic world it's highly unlikely that you will be able to coordinate with another country. That was obviously true in the past. The question is whether it could be different today. Well, obviously, if you have the EU integrating like that, it becomes more and more possible to happen across countries.
Well,
The question is also whether there's any possibility when you actually do it. When the Bolsheviks took power, when Lenin took power, although he saw it as happening in Russia, he didn't believe that it would stay in Russia. He thought this was an opportunity where it would indeed spread quite quickly. So it wasn't a question of taking power because you could, as it were, finished. He did believe that it would happen in general there. And it's possible it might have happened. If you look at the different events which occurred, many of them were accidents. Even the defeat of the Red Army at the Vistula was really an accident. The fact is that Tukhachevsky had been given the wrong information.
Not helped by Stalin making wrong moves as well.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll go through a series of other accidents as well. So an alternative might have been possible. It might have happened, but it didn't happen. And that's the reality. Unfortunately, we don't live that long. So we can hope that we might see it. Thank you.